Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you as well as our speakers here at the Museum Tengeli for today's event, which forms part of the program accompanying the exhibition Scenes from the Invention of Democracy, which will be on view until the 1st of March. It features the work of Austrian artist Oliver Ressler, who is sitting right next to me, and who for many years has been operating at the interface of art and activism, producing installations, projects in public space and videos. He has had numerous solo exhibitions all over the world and participated in more than 400 group exhibitions, as well as many biennials. Here in Basel, we are presenting 4 of Ressler's 42 video works, or was it more, Oliver? How many video works? 42? Yeah, or 44 now, all of which turn on political, social, and environmental issues and derive all the more urgency from the ongoing climate crisis and the global rise of authoritarianism. What you see on the photo here right next to me is the 8-channel video installation What is Democracy from 2009, which is based on interviews with activists and political analysts from 18 cities all over the world. And this work opens up a wide range of perspectives that even years later, until today, have lost none of their relevance. On the contrary, I would say it seems more urgent than ever to address this question, what is democracy, and to defend liberal democracy. So a lot of things have changed in the last 17 years, and I'm happy to welcome not only Oliver Ressler, but also Eva Majewska and Gabor Czilak, who were interviewed by Oliver back at the time for this video installation, What is Democracy? Unfortunately, Claire Saunders had to cancel at short notice due to illness, but I am sure that an interesting discussion will unfold between the 3 of you on questions of democracy and of the political development of the recent years. And I'm happy to hand over to you, Oliver, who will introduce Eva and Gabor in more detail.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tabea Banizzi, for the kind introduction. Thanks to Roland Wetzel for inviting me to have the exhibition here and for Tabea to curate it. It's the first time the project What is Democracy is being presented in Switzerland. And even though this is one of the most often presented works I ever did, large installations like this was presented like 21 or 22 times. But so far, it's the first time that I have the pleasure and the privilege to invite people with whom I had this conversation 17, 18 years ago about what democracy is, and to have a conversation also about what might have changed in this time that lies in between, which is a time where we had the Brexit, we had an increasing authoritarianism, 2 administrations with Donald Trump, we had the global pandemic, we have an increasing visibility and recognition of climate breakdown. Therefore, I think it's a good time to talk about what democracy means today and maybe how it should look like, or what might be directions that are worth fighting for. So, as Tabea already mentioned, Claire Saunders unfortunately had to cancel her trip. 2 days ago, she informed us she was not able to come here for health reasons. Maybe I start with Eva Majewska. She's a feminist theorist of culture and associate professor at the SWPS University in Warsaw, Poland, working on the queer archive theory project, Public Against Their Will, the production of subjects in the archives of the Hyacinth operations. She's the author of 7 books and author of numerous articles in eFlux, Science, Third Text, Journal of Utopian Studies, and others. In 2023, she received the Emma Goldman Award from the Flex Foundation for her research on equality, and her research focuses on archive studies, dialectics of the weak, queer feminist critical theory, and anti-fascism. She lives and works between Berlin and Warsaw. And Gabor Csillag originally taught cultural anthropology at the university. When he became a green activist, he began his work at the grassroots NGO, then participated in the creation of a green anti-globalization movement, finally became one of the founders and first communications director of Hungary's first Green Party, where he developed a special form of activist communication built on actions and protest aimed at the increasingly authoritarian regime of Viktor Orban. Currently, he works on strategic communications at a new NGO called Green Transformation, with the aim of creating a green progressive hub linking various political movements. Those of you who know the installation, What is Democracy, might know that it's based primarily on the replies, on the answers to the question, what is democracy? For those who haven't yet seen it, or for those who have seen it maybe for a few weeks ago and need a reminder, we selected a few excerpts, statements, just 2 minutes per person to give us a reminder. And we included Claire Saunders in this collection.
One of the things that we see happening in the global justice movement is social forums, which are horizontal platforms where people can come along and share their views, and everything is supposed to be decided on a consensus basis. And instead of voting on pre-formed choices, the idea is that you have a debate and it's the most rational argument that wins over the decision making, and you have consensus to the point where everybody is more or less happy with what's been proposed. This is an idealistic way of running democracy, the idea that everybody gets involved, everybody has a discussion, you be deliberative and you come to an overall agreement. Of course, there are big problems in trying to translate this from a small local group meeting into a national setting. And there are even problems in trying to make a social forum or a small group meeting itself democratic. Because what happens in the global justice movement is you get some small groups trying to run consensus decision making, and they develop their own culture and their own way of doing things. For example, some groups use hand signals to, if you all agree, you do this, if you want to veto something, you do this. And this is supposed to be participative, but if a newcomer comes along and they're seeing all these weird gestures going on, it actually makes it quite exclusive and difficult to have wide participation. So not only is it a problem trying to have this consensus horizontal decision making happening on a national level, it's also difficult even at a local level.
Here in Central Eastern Europe, we live in a so-called representative democracy, but I think everybody is able to see by now that this is a pretty hollowed out something. You don't need to be specifically critical minded to notice that what we call a representative democracy is not really working in an adequate way. People vote not on the basis of information, but basically due to cultural traditions or emotional, often irrational motifs. I think in Hungary especially, the whole idea of direct democracy is in a very experimental phase, because for direct democracy to work, you need at least three things. You need access to information. I think participation is all about information. If you don't have proper information levels, then you really don't know what you're making decisions about. It's also about being socialized, so to speak, into a deliberative process. Direct democracy and the experiences with direct democracy involve a special procedural knowledge. This is very important because otherwise people don't know what they're making decisions about, they can get frustrated. So direct democracy doesn't mean going on the street and shouting around. It means that people have a say depending on information. They are given the information, they are given the process, they are given procedural rules, and the third thing is they're given a real opportunity. Somebody recently said that we don't have a democracy because people don't feel that they are stakeholders. I think this is pretty relevant. If you want people to participate, you have to show them that their decisions really have weight, they really have a say, that the decisions they make will really go into a process that leads to results.
My impression is that most of the inhabitants of this country actually have no idea of how much they can do if they want, and how much opportunities they have to actually influence the decision making around them. And I would really like this to change. We also have all the university sector and all the great debate about what democracy is and is not. And we have a discussion about Habermas and Chantal Mouffe and the fictionary character of contemporary liberal democracy and its fake consens, and how an antagonism would improve everything. But on a very basic practical level, unfortunately, this reflection does not bring much, I must say, which is a hard thing to say for an academic, really, because I'm teaching these theories. But when I see the exchange between this university theory and the everyday living, which is basically constituted of deciding whether we want a street here or not, I mean, we can get some inspiration from the big names and big debates, but imposing philosophical theories on my neighbors would be a way of dominating them, and also a way of demanding a respect, and also a way of making me a perfect candidate for a representative of them, which I would really like to avoid.
So the first question I would have for you is, how would you see these statements in the shadow of what happened since then, or to raise the question differently, if I would ask you this seemingly easy question, what is democracy today, how would you respond?
Thank you so much for having me here, and for you also for coming and spending the evening with us on super important matter, I think. So thank you also to Oliver for bringing the topic again, because it seems evident, no? It's an ancient concept. Democracy has been with us in this continent for millennia, you can say. So the urgency of asking this question might seem distant, let's say. And then on the other hand, with all the highly undemocratic changes and undemocratic processes that we are observing, but also participating, it might seem like in this essay from Václav Havel that I'm often quoting from 1978, which is my year of birth. So I'm kind of touched by seeing me younger, you know, on the screen, but I'll try to go through. So in Havel's essay, we read about the people who feel powerless because the situation seems to be so stable. You have the USSR versus America, you know, the empires in this kind of embrace, in which, from the perspective of an intellectual sitting in a prison in Czechoslovakia, nothing can possibly change. No, so there is a little sense in thinking about agency, about resistance, because it seems that everything is going to be the same forever. And yet, Havel argues, and by means of very quick translation, his essay traveled to Poland, and then 2 years later we see Solidarność movement forming in Poland with 10 million people joining in. So these words from Havel inspired a lot of people because he decided to speak about resistance of the ordinary person. He decided to speak about a grocery store assistant who can resist, even in this situation when there is the big USSR versus the big America, far, far away, very dangerous and very motivated to keep the status quo. Still, the resistance of everyday person matters. So, answering to your question now, for me, democracy obviously is the power of the people, and for me, the people means everybody. So I don't look at democracy in the way that, you know, patriarchy has taught us, that basically women do something else and men do democracy, and also wealthy men and, you know, men who have the genealogy of being, I don't know, Athenians for 3 generations, or I don't know, German and not Jewish for some generations, and other dramatic examples could follow. So basically for me, democracy is a system which you can push towards more and more equality, and you can understand it as basically the universal right to politics. So I would call it that way as well. Everybody has the. So when I spoke in the video about kind of, you know, being hesitant about representing my neighbors, I didn't mean that I'm too lazy to do it or whatever. What I meant was that there would be something incredibly violent in just throwing, you know, concept, Habermasian, you know, deliberative process or whatever, on people without the genuine process of discussing what it means, but also discussing what it would mean in this specific situation of a motorway being introduced in it. So from the perspective of 17 or 18 years later, the highway in my direct, you know, neighborhood seems like a small problem. Basically, you know, with Trump invading Venezuela, with Putin invading Ukraine, with Netanyahu killing Palestine, basically, we are facing problems that are more grave, more complex, more dangerous, more brutal than a highway. Also, 8 years of Kaczynski governments in Poland, that was a lesson basically that things can change very quickly, that democratic system can be dissolved quite immediately. So we've been building it for so many years, and then within 3 first years of Kaczynski's power, we have, for instance, the executive dominating the legislative and the juridical system. So one of the classical elements of fascization is basically when executive becomes the main power, right? It's in Carl Schmitt's partisan politics, in the state of exception theory, which laid way for the system of German law to become the fascist law in 1930s. So in this concept, if executive is getting stronger, you need to fear of fascism coming in. Also, if a group or groups of people are called enemy and actively attacked, not just criticized, actively destroyed, then we can speak of fascism. So fascism is, so answering your question again, I'm talking about fascism not because I like it in any way. I'm actually, I mean, it's the greatest danger, not just for us as societies, as humans, as women, as queers, but also I think fascism is the antithesis of democracy. So I wanted to bring fascism in to show that if there is an anti-democratic, like dialectically opposed binary opposition to democracy, it's fascism for me, because it does not have this equality in the project. It treats certain groups of people as enemies with all the aggressive, negative approach that you can imagine. it also promotes the executive. So the most direct forms of power over deliberation and over procedures of justice, so also decision making is reduced to decree. This is how Zygmunt Bauman was writing about fascism. It's like, instead of a whole process, you have decrees. And yeah, that would be my first answer. And also, again, thank you for getting us to talk about it. I think there is something important in it.
Thank you. Gabor.
Yes, hi. Thank you also to Oliver and to everybody who is involved in this very exciting talk for inviting us. I think I will stay in my lane. From that point of view, it was good that you played this clip. I was talking back then when I was much, much thinner and had many illusions about democracy, about information. And in theory, in the past, I don't know how many years, we have been harvesting information everywhere. Information is around us. So you could argue that no problem, we have all the information we need. But that's not the case. We live in a post-truth society, as they say, which is extremely scary. There is an overabundance of information, but the information is not at all reliable. And politics and populism especially, which has also always been built on manipulating information, is doing this again and on a much larger scale than anything previously imaginable. You mentioned 8 years, I think, of Kaczynski, so I'm here after 16 years of Orban. And that's, again, why it's interesting, because this was in 2009, just 1 year before Orban was elected. So basically my whole experience since then has been within the Orban regime, which is built on manipulating information and which is built on hollowing out democracy. It's, in theory, it's called illiberal democracy, which the biggest fan of which is Donald Trump, clearly and declaredly, a big fan of Orban. Orban systematically worked on disassembling democracy, keeping sort of this Potemkin village, I don't know if you use that term, seemingly the institutions are intact, but nothing really is close to participation, and in fact participation is getting narrower and narrower. So I think democracy hasn't changed much, but the 21st century shifts that we're seeing, I'm going to talk about a paradigm shift, I'm sure, which I think has occurred since COVID. Since COVID, many things have happened. COVID itself, the Ukrainian war, you mentioned the second election and the first election of Donald Trump, and many things. If I would have said we would be talking about the invasion of Greenland, everybody, 10 years ago, everybody would have laughed at me. I would have laughed at myself. And we live in this strange information-ish society where people say things, but they don't resemble the truth. So I think if I look at democracy from the point of view of being able to access dependable information, I will be the pessimist here tonight. And I think we're in a much worse state than we were back then.
So you both come from countries that underwent a phase with very far right-wing political governments. If I introduce this term of fascism into our discussion here, would you say that this term applies on the so-called illiberal democracy in Hungary, or the, I don't know, right-wing clerical regime in Poland?
Not only I would, but also I did already in 2004-05 when and this is a very interesting case, I think. In 2005, Poland also had parliamentary elections in which everybody was assuming it was the liberals who are again gonna, take the majority in the parliament and therefore bring the government, etc., etc. So everybody was certain this is happening. And then suddenly, Kuba Schroeder, our friend who is a cultural worker and intellectual in Poland, he invited me and Aleksandra Polisiewicz to make a documentary about something, basically. He said, pick Warsaw and Weimar and do something that puts together the two cities. So we sat down in 2005 and we were like, Weimar, Warsaw, what do we even, think about? And then we realized that we both actually expect the right wing to take over. So Kaczyński was already on the rise in 2005, and we thought he would win this election. And so we decided to compare Poland 2005, Weimar Republic in the 20s, and to see how far this comparison takes us. So we knew it was comparison. It wasn't to say they were the same, but it was to explore the possibility of Poland turning towards fascism already in 2005. And so we were asking different people, what do you think, whether Poland could collapse into fascism? And everybody was calling us witches or hysteric. So that was like the two etiquettes that we proudly took in as like fierce feminists. We were like, obviously we are called this, what else? So that was one thing. But we were thinking, okay, there is more and more of executive power. There is more and more suicides, which is also a statistic that somehow matters when fascism comes to power. There is a lot of unemployment, but also a resentment. So after joining the EU, Poland was not yet getting the good things from EU, but was contributing a lot of labor, and we had unemployment of 25% officially. Unofficially, in some regions, it was 60%. Many branches of industry were destroyed, etc., etc. So it was a moment when there was enough resentment and enough kind of ground for nationalism to come in and organize the desires and the needs of the people, basically. But everybody was calling us hysteric or this. And then in October, Kaczyński Lech is appointed to be president of Poland. Kaczyński Jarosław becomes the prime minister. We had two twins running the country. PiS and Liga Polskich Rodzin, ultra right-wing party, made a coalition and they won the majority in parliament. And everybody was coming again to us and like, how did you know? We went to statistic office, we did research basically. We didn't just, stay on what was known. We decided to scratch the surface a little bit, and it's important, I think, always. But so this was the experience of 2005, and at that time already I was thinking of I was using the word fascism because I mentioned Carl Schmitt. There are those three elements of fascism always. Executive power wins over. Enemy groups are appointed, the Jews, the gays, the lesbians, the feminists, the liberal opposition, whoever, Roma people, etc., etc. And they are not only criticized, but they are actively stripped of their rights, of their privileges, of their significance, and of life eventually. And unfortunately, this is the part of doctrine of Schmitt. But there is also this exemption of the sovereign outside of law. So there is this paradox of power, which consists in the fact that the ruling class is creating the laws, but does not have to follow them. So this is the three elements and for me, this Schmittian, let's say, definition of fascism is an important one, and it works. So in Poland, 2005, it worked. I saw these three elements, and then we had almost fascist government. Then in Hungary, similar thing, executive power, precisely. Everything seems the same. But it's executive who runs, it's the president who has all the prerogatives, no? And he does whatever he wants, and he doesn't have to follow the law. There are also enemy groups. There is refugees, there is liberals, intelligentsia, I don't know, all kinds of groups, gay people, trans people now in Hungary. So these three factors, so I was one of those people who said, listen, let's not worry whether it's post-fascism, pre-fascism, before fascism, almost fascism. We had many discussions, and I respect tremendously all the scholars involved. However, I disagree very strongly, because I think, I saw today this comic strip of dinosaurs looking at this thing falling from the sky and debating, is it comet or is it asteroid? And the subtitle for this comic strip was the first idiotic discussion on the Earth. Yeah. So I'm like, again, idiotic is maybe very judgmental. I don't mean it seriously. I'm just saying it's like irrelevant discussion. Let's say. So very interesting whether we have fascism or not, and we can see. Do we build concentration camp? Is concentration camp a significant element of fascism? Perhaps yes, but these tendencies that we observe today were present also in German society in the 1930s before the camps were created. So we should, I think, fear, if we see these elements, we should try to behave in order to resist the possibility of creating the camps. What we see in America also, at first there was this buffon, saying Greenland should be ours. It was ridiculous. But now we have ICE killing people on the street and claiming it was self-defense of poor policemen, which it wasn't, and everybody knows here. So basically, so I think the notion of fascism, we should compare. Historical comparisons are very important. So we should compare, we should test, we should treat it as hypotheses. We can, if people resist speaking about fascism, okay, let's talk about fascization, yes? But let's not go into detailed discussion whether it's post-neo, this, that, semi. I don't care, honestly. It is important to me to see to what extent this fascist scenario is already under construction. Also, obviously, there is going to be changes because we are 1.5 century after, or 1 century after the beginnings of fascism in Germany. So obviously, it's not going to be the same. But there are those structural elements that should be followed, I think, and we should be very attentively looking at the executive, how much it took already. We should look at the enemy constructions, how many and how these groups are treated. And we should look at the exemption of the current sovereign powers from the law obedience. So if we have authoritarian presidents or governments that really disrespect the law, also that is a symptom of something that could become fascism.
Gabor.
Well, I just wrote an article a couple of weeks ago where I did exactly what you were talking about, compared the Schmidt points to the US and to Hungary. And it was scary because you could just tick all of them off. You mentioned a few. The cult of power is another one, which is very important in fascism. And if you listen to Stephen Miller, who is the big advisor to Donald Trump, who said, or you just listen to Trump, who says, we're a big power, we could do whatever we want. And in Hungary, which is a small, tiny country, but the version is Brussels won't tell us what to do. Again, because we are very strong, which we're not, of course, but you could use this. The myth of a golden age, make America great again in Hungary, it's going back to post-socialist times, which was fascist, technically, literally. So you can tick them off. But I would bring in another thing. What is the most diabolical about this illiberal democracy is that it has its nice name. You don't call it fascism, you call it seems like a form of democracy. Where it's not, and what you mentioned about the exceptions and the institutional power. When I was a green activist, I also tried to protect this or that natural unit of land here and there, urban, rural. In Hungary, you have something that's called a special government project, which means they just take something and all the laws no longer apply to that. They put a stamp on it, this is a special government project, and every single law, environmental, social, taxation, etc., it's exactly what you said. For them, it no longer exists, that the laws that were previously and that still exist for everybody else, that doesn't apply. So yes, my answer is unfortunately yes, which is really scary. And I would add one more thing, which is even scarier and that we can see every day, the widening of our tolerance. History. For me, the past few years of watching Trump has been the biggest history lesson for understanding fascist Germany, for example. When every day you have something that you would not have tolerated 3 years ago, but now you say, maybe, well, whatever, I don't know. And you have the political power doing things which previously nobody could imagine. It was just, there was a cordon sanitaire and, you couldn't do that. And we do these compromises every single day until we realize that invading Greenland, why not,
maybe it's possible. And that is very human. Because, you know, conflict is scary, everybody has their comfort zone, but if you add up all these little steps, these little compromises and these little steps saying, well, maybe next year I'll do something really radical, but not now, we have a completely transformed society, which is what we have now.
I mean, historically, since the 1970s, we've seen an increase in the numbers of liberal democracies. And meanwhile, we see a decline both in numbers of states, but that can be categorized as liberal democracies, but also in numbers of people living in these liberal democracies. I had a look at this huge democracy report from 2025, which is a report by the WeDem Institute based on several academic groups working in different areas. Globally, they say, meanwhile, the autocracies dominate already, so there are much more autocracies than liberal and electoral democracies combined. And even countries that we could see very problematic in terms of democracies like Israel and the US, Poland, they are also still in the category of an electoral democracy in this report. So probably the situation is much darker than these statistics might imply. What's your response?
It depends. It very much depends, because if you look at this statistic in the 1980s, you would see like socialist democracies, many of them. Were they democratic? I don't know. I grew up in one of them, and you know, like I grew up with a sense that I told you earlier about, which was that I will probably never leave the country because of my father's political involvement. We were like deprived of the possibility of having a passport and basically going anywhere. So that's how I grew up. So my memory of this democracy is kind of, you know, critical. Let's put it this way. Albeit with years, I learned, you know, about all kinds of like social security that system was building for millions of people and was valuable and important. So I would say that it's an interesting statistic, and it's maybe scary to look at it. But I would go, you know, I would go someplace else. I would think about what are the elements of this authoritarianism, because I think we didn't really like investigate it properly. And I would like to add one more thing, which is misogyny. Misogyny understood as like super deep patriarchal hatred for the weak. I would call it this way. You know, that would be my working definition of patriarchy. So this is not essentialist, and it doesn't diagnose misogyny only in relation to people born with like feminine bodies or something. It's also about the femininity attributed to or experienced by trans persons, by people who are colonized or racialized. Very often they are like accused of being feminine by the privileged groups. So I think there is something very deeply not just sexist, but also misogynist in the sense of hating the weak. And I think that is the direction that I would kind of intuitively go to. So not to reject your question, but somehow also I find this very difficult to answer because I don't know what to say. I would say I share your feelings. It's like scary. But as a scholar, I know that when we look at statistics, we have to pick 2 or 3 periods and compare, because otherwise we just look at one period, we don't know what we compare it with. So you probably did it as well, so I'm not saying you didn't, but for me, this one moment in time, I don't know exactly what it means. I don't know what it means. But if we take this moment, and then 1990, for instance, 75 and 1935, also, I don't know the situation of majority of countries in detail. I just simply don't know. This is my big problem with direct democracy, because as Claire was saying, we should, have informed debates and I don't have time. I grew up in Catholicism, where life is eternal. This is what I learned in school, that I'm going to live forever. I don't believe it anymore. I'm sorry, I don't want to discriminate against Catholic believers, but I don't believe it. As an atheist, I'm thinking, okay, my life has finitude, it's going to end at a certain point, and I don't also have, so I can't investigate everything, which I regret, because I would love to approach your question more decently somehow. But I'm kind of interjecting, those things that worry me currently, and that I can have some relevant answers, and that would be this direction, to kind of investigate, okay, what might be some essential characteristics of today's fascism, and how, therefore, we can build resistances, also in places like Ukraine, also in places like Gaza, also in places like Venezuela right now, also in places like Poland or Hungary, where, especially in Hungary, after 16 years of this, whatever it is that you have, people are basically much less enthusiastic for resisting, I think. And I see it with a lot of sadness. I know some curators from Hungary, I have some other friends, and I look at this freezing effect that this kind of regime has, and I don't like it. Because I don't need to agree with everybody in Hungary, but I don't want people to be sad that they might feel that their possibilities are restricted. This is something that I find very painful.
I'm not sure I can give a definite answer to the question, simply because I don't see what's going to happen in the near future. In Hungary, for the first time in 16 years, there's a possibility of getting rid of Orbán. In theory, the US has a presidential cycle that lasts for 4 years, and you can't be president for more than two terms, in theory. But would I be surprised if we don't get rid of Orbán? Would I be surprised if there is a campaign to have a third, fourth, fifth term for Donald Trump? No, I wouldn't be surprised. And that's why I think things are different now. It's so funny. I mean, I'm very old. So my parents were alive during the Second World War. And they do the parents' things of, you don't know what it's like when, and we didn't. But the perspective of the last 5 years has made me understand that, yes, this generation, my generation, or a couple of generations, is extremely lucky. And we actually thought that that's the way it works. You have the European Union, and you have democracies expanding all around the world, and things are getting gradually better. That's what I grew up in. And, the Berlin Wall fell, etc., etc. And now it's like, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen in the next 10 years. And I can't say that this sort of naive historical progression that actually did exist, because, for a long time, with the exception of the Yugoslav situation, we didn't have wars in Europe, etc., etc. So we had many pillars that have been broken, and I don't know what happens after that. There could be a good scenario, and when I talk to very young people who weren't traumatized in the same regime I was, they have very inspiring beliefs that things will get better soon. I honestly don't know whether this is cyclical and we will get rid of this post-fascist regimes all around the place. Maybe, or maybe not. I don't know. And the big question, and we talked about this earlier, is, do you need a cataclysm for this? Because yes, things change, but do they change in a slow progress of basically a peaceful transformation? And we haven't talked about the climate crisis, and we need to. Everybody I talk to, my green colleagues, they say one thing: it's just too late. It's too late. There is no way that there won't be a cataclysm. And they don't know if it's going to be big or small or localized or whatever. And the other thing they say is a point of wisdom, perhaps, that it seems that that's the only thing that people learn from. This is not very bright, I'm sorry. But, you know, my generation grew up in a cataclysm-less world where you had change, but you didn't have these big world catastrophes, at least here. I don't know if that's the state of affairs at the moment.
But I think the knowledge and the opinion of many scientists that probably it's too late to tackle global warming, which probably the majority of the scientists might also agree with, climate scientists might agree with, does very often leads then in people towards the opinion that you don't have to care anymore about it because it's too late. And the conclusion of this knowledge must be exactly the opposite, right? That now that it's too late to limit it to, I mean, 1.5 is history, right? I mean, this is impossible, even though you might hear other opinions about that, but you might at least try 2 degrees and not to exceed it that much, not to overshoot it for too long, the 2 degrees. And for that you have urgently fight now, and this requires very radical steps in order to reach a limit of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. What does this mean to fight for democracy in the middle of climate breakdown?
It's not that I have answer, yeah? But when you were talking about the climate, both of you, I was thinking, okay, what would be my response? And learning from Havel, you know, so learning from this very patient situation of somebody who was in jail. So really, like, not much to do. You can write your book, you can write your essay. Luckily, in Havel's case, it was a talented writer, so, you know, something really inspiring came out of his work. And actually, I was thinking, because now we're talking a lot about like censoring academia and, you know, all this democracy also has its, the end of democracy, as we know it, has some elements in academia. So people are censored severely in America, but also in Hungary, in Poland, everywhere. And that's very sad. However, I'm thinking, so I'm trying to figure out like how to answer to this question without making the pessimism even bigger. And it's not, and on the other hand, I don't want to cheer up and be like a cheerleader for an impossible optimism, because that doesn't make any sense either. So I'm thinking about Donna Haraway, this Californian zoologist turned humanist, very interesting intellectual trajectory, I think, who is also an activist in many ways and a very inspiring writer. And she has this book from almost a decade ago already, Staying with the Trouble, where she speaks of, you know, the ability that we need to profess of not trying to find, as she calls it, I love this formulation, easy techno fixes. Yeah, this little tool will save the world. That's a very popular neoliberal solution, you know, immediate AI or I don't know what, not using plastic bags. Okay, this is very good step in a good direction, but plastic bags are one of the gazilliard of problems that we have. So on one hand, not searching for easy techno fixes and this kind of easy optimism, which I really don't think is necessary. On the other hand, however, falling into the despair and desperation is another risk, yeah? That we will find ourselves in this beauty of melancholia. I mean, it's fascinating, but this is not time for it. And one other intellectual that really is fascinating for me is obviously this Polish Jewish German, and I like how it sounds all together, Polish Jewish German intellectual Rosa Luxemburg, who wrote in correspondence, also from jail, a lot of time, you know, corresponding and writing in jail. So she was writing those cheering letters to her friends, Clara Zetkin and other very brave feminists, cheering them up, interestingly. So it wasn't, they were like, oh, Rosa, poor Rosa, how are you in jail? And she was like, I'm fine, I'm collecting plants, I'm making herbarium, you know, really this kind of optimism that is very inspiring today. So she wrote also about how the truly oppressed don't have time and opportunity and conditions to fall in despair. How the position of melancholy is only available to those who can afford it somehow. But those who have to struggle on daily basis, there is no chance. You can have all the predisposition you want, artistic and psychological, to be melancholic, but if you have 5 children and live in super big poverty, you just can't do it. So I'm thinking also of this urgency that if we don't experience it directly, we need to learn to experience it basically. And we need to, you mentioned, I think, zones of comfort, no? Discomfort is a terrible thing because we like it so much. It's very cozy, it's gemütlich, I don't know, it's like so, but without, sort of getting out of this cocoon, I don't think we can, be realistic and be optimistic, be pessimistic, be whatever like anybody wants. I'm very democratic this way. I don't need everyone to be like me. And also I'm not very consistent. I can be optimistic and pessimistic at the same very moment. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't think I have a solution to any of the big problems, but I think that at least considering my long activist but also pedagogic experience, I think I found a way or a kind of attitude that might be useful in these conditions, which is let's stay with this thing, whatever it is, however scary it is, however complex and incomprehensible. I don't have technical education. I don't understand when people talk to me about emissions even. I sort of understand it, honestly. But does it disqualify me from putting effort into stopping the global ecological catastrophe? No, I don't think so. And I think this ability of staying with the trouble, learning about it, but also trying to democratically limit the drama of the coming catastrophe, I think that's an interesting position. I don't know.
Good news and bad news. If I look at the optimistic perspective, you mentioned something like, even though the situation is dire, this is exactly the time to do something. And for me, that's continuous. I'm an activist. There is no situation where I think everything is hopeless, and there is no situation where I don't feel a responsibility to do something. I don't know what, but something, anything. You mentioned the experience of the Hungarians during the Orban and how depressing it is, and that's genuine. I mean, many people left the country simply and actually came here, many of them. If I walk the streets, it's really weird that I hear Hungarians everywhere. So that's obviously, in a way, it's an individual solution, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of young people who have left. So I'm not saying that this isn't real. It is. The cataclysm, which I think will occur, opens eyes. I'm sorry. I can't say, I mean, there is a generation which is ready to do things, perhaps, and there is another that isn't. But by the nature of cataclysm, it sort of reduces your choices, and you're forced to react. So, on one hand, but I'm ill. I mean, people who I talk to think I'm crazy because I don't see any alternative to activism. But I think things will happen soon, and I think they're already happening, which will open many people's eyes, and this comfort zone thing will be reevaluated. Whether by choice or by force, I don't know.
Regarding people who are ready to do things and maybe to set up alternative structures, as a last question before we'll open this conversation into the public, into our audience here. When I raised this question, what is democracy? It was not only meant to kind of talk about the problems of representative or liberal or electoral democracies, but also about alternative ways of democratic organizing. And in the past 17 or 18 years since you replied already to this question in front of the camera. Are there any recent current democratic experiments, forms of organizing, social movements or developments within states you find inspiring or encouraging?
I think both in my theoretical work and in activism, I came to appreciate the form of counterpublics. So as in Kluge and Knecht, as in Nancy Fraser. So the concept of counterpublics, I would like to introduce it, also the practice of it, as an interesting form of practicing democracy. Whether it's direct or not, we will see. But so after the Second World War, many concepts, obviously, of public sphere have been created, and most of them were appreciating the liberal democracy as hegemonized by the middle class. So where only the privileged men had the right to even represent the families, as in John Rawls' theory of justice. So this kind of concepts which were sharing the experience of bourgeoisie, of middle class, as the hegemonic one. So the matters of politics, the common matters, were the matters of decision-making, debates, but not of economy, not of gender, not of, and then, so the most important example of the book about it from the German-speaking world was obviously Jürgen Habermas's habilitation from 62. And then 10 years later, we have the book from Alexander Kluge and Oskar Knecht, who decided to enter a polemic with this concept of kind of bourgeoisie or middle class dominated public sphere. And they came up with the idea that actually working classes, so factory workers, also produce democracy. They also have their public spheres, which are not hegemonic, which are not, presented in media and public debate, but where they debate economy, for instance, so salaries, working conditions, and things like that, as matters of the public, because for them, this is the common good. This is the important thing. Then in the 90s, Nancy Fraser, American feminist author, wrote about the contemporary feminist American movement as a counterpublics, where the women's rights and gender equality is the core topic. And then so this concept of public sphere, from this very homogeneous, from Aristotle, we know the basics, yeah? It's like white men who have been Athenians since 3 generations, who have enough goods not to worry about basic needs. So this is an important condition. This is like early version of bourgeois privilege, yeah? So this kind of things, so Athenians and white and rich and not slaves, obviously, not women, not children, So we have politics and democracy and public sphere limited to a very, very small group of people. So the concept of counterpublics shows us an oppositional way of making democracy. So that's one thing. So it can be very grassroots, and I believe in factories, in described by Kluge and Knecht, but also in like Solidarność movement in the 1980. You have very grassroots, sit-downs, basically, of people who discuss the demands, the postulates. And while I was looking at the counterpublics, I found it very important not to limit the social movements to bodies in the street. So I appreciate very much street protests. I have been orchestrating them for 30 years or more. So basically, really, I started going on demonstrations when I was 2 years old, not going really, being carried by parents, but that's how long it goes. So it's like more than 40 years of experience. So I have this and I appreciate it. However, when we look at the people in the streets, they are always saying something, they are always reclaiming something. And there is, I think, a level of dignity in recognizing what this crowd wants. So I believe that many of my colleagues who are just looking at the performance of bodies, very important, bodies are important, matter is important, but I think it's a little bit disrespectful not to notice what these people claim, what they want, what is their political demand, how they constitute themselves as political subject. And I don't mean to read them in this very complex political, theoretical way. No, but I don't want to see them muted. So this concept of counterpublics, it allows to see, even in very crazy gatherings, shouting, crowds, and then the demand that is being produced as well. So there is this element of articulation of a claim, which I cherish and find very important. So that would be something that I find inspirational, a concept, but also a practice of making public sphere, so of taking the concept of public sphere away from those privileged white hands, basically, and seeing it in other groups and seeing also the diversity and the contradictions of different counterpublics.
When you were kind enough to introduce me, you mentioned the word hub, and that's what I'm doing now, and that's a very important lesson for me. I was an academic teaching cultural anthropology at university a long, long time ago, and I wanted to become more active, so I started teaching action anthropology, which is, a combination of activity within society. And then I left the academic world and became a grassroots activist. And then I built an NGO, and then the NGO wasn't effective enough, and we created a party. The party got into parliament, etc., etc. And now I am way back to small groups, to facilitating dialogue, empowering different types of people. For me, as a green person, what we've spoken about is this eco-social coming together is extremely important, because yes, many people think that the Greens are basically privileged upper middle class people who have nothing to do, and that's a legitimate criticism to a certain degree. You have to bring this to completely different experience. So I believe in eco-social hubs at the moment. I think that's the most relevant experience. And I would underline experience and understanding. Because yes, we tend to go to protests as something that is a cultural part of our automatic reaction to things. But that's not enough. I mean, just protesting, while it's an important element of empowerment, but the level of consciousness there and the articulation that's there has its limit. So I believe in I think you have to go back to I wouldn't say the grassroots level, but to what I was trying to talk about 19 years ago or whatever, that people have to understand and they have to be empowered to make decisions and internalize these and understand that they are stakeholders in democracy. If they don't feel that, their actions can be hollowed out or manipulated very easily.